The State of Crypto is presented by Tron, connecting the world to the power of cryptocurrency.
Welcome back to First Mover. The two most crypto-relevant committees in the U.S. House met yesterday in an attempt to arrive at the best legislative approach to digital assets. Our next guest was there, Timothy Massad, Research Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and Director of the Digital Assets Policy Project. Timothy previously served as Chairman of CFTC under President Obama. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you here. Now, you were a witness in yesterday's joint House hearing on crypto's future. Congressman French Hill, chair of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Digital Assets, emphasized the need to craft legislation that creates a new regulatory framework. Let's have a listen.
What we decide to do in this Congress this year will shape whether or not the digital asset ecosystem has the opportunity to thrive here in the United States. But right now, there's not a workable framework in place for digital asset issuers and intermediaries to be regulated effectively by the SEC or the CFTC.
All right, Timothy, let's start here. Do you agree with what Congressman Hill was saying?
Well, I think it's great, first of all, that the two subcommittees of the House that have jurisdiction here, the one of the Agriculture Committee and the House Financial Services Committee, I think it's great they were getting together and doing a joint hearing to look at this and trying to come up with legislation. Unfortunately, I didn't see much evidence that Republicans and Democrats are finding common ground. You know, I think the Republicans have a view that they want to take jurisdiction away from the SEC by rewriting the securities laws to create a new category of digital commodities, if you will, that would not be securities and that the CFTC would have jurisdiction over in the spot market. And, you know, I think the challenge there is that new category, depending on how you define it, could easily be too broad, could easily create loopholes or other unintended consequences. And it's also, frankly, not clear they'll provide sufficient funding to the CFTC to do the job. So I think there's just a lot of skepticism on the part of Democrats. And I think it'll be challenging to come up with a bipartisan approach. You know, I suggested an alternative clarity and improve investor protection without rewriting the securities laws, and that's that Congress mandate that the SEC and the CFTC get together and formulate joint rules ideally through a self-regulatory organization that would apply to all these platforms. And that would give us the clarity we need. It would let the market go forward, and it wouldn't involve rewriting the law, in a significant way that might have unintended consequences.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that self-regulatory organization? How would that work? How do we put that into place?
Sure. You know, we've relied on self-regulatory organizations in our securities and derivatives markets and the regulation of those for decades, really since the SEC began. And by self-regulatory, it's very important to make clear what we mean by that in that tradition. And that is an entity that involves the industry, but that is supervised very closely by the regulator. It's not the industry going off and just doing things on their own. The SEC and the CFTC in this case would appoint the directors. They would approve the rules that the SRO comes up with. But the idea is that way, you know, what we need here are largely the same standards regardless of whether a token falls in the securities bucket or the commodities bucket when it comes to trading. You know, most people trade through centralized intermediaries. That's where 90% of the spot market volume occurs. We don't today have a regulator for the spot market unless a token is deemed a security. And we've had this huge kind of debate about, is it a security? Is it a commodity? So what I'm saying is, and Jay Clayton, by the way, the former Republican appointed chair, I should say, of the SEC under President Trump, he and I have kind of formulated this together. The idea is that the SEC and the CFTC would get together and do joint rules. They could either do them without an SRO. I think, frankly, it would be more efficient to create the SRO. Those rules, we would say, would apply to any platform that today trades Bitcoin or Ether. Now, you can make that list longer if you want. The idea is simply, let's establish jurisdiction without having to write a new definition of digital commodities or digital securities or digital assets or whatever it is. You know, there's no platform really that can be significant without trading one of those two. If you want to throw in Tether or a couple more just to make sure we get everybody, you could do that. But then you'd come up with these standards, and they would be the basic standards we need: protection of customer assets, prevention of fraud and manipulation, prohibition on conflicts of interest, adequate disclosure, adequate reporting, risk management, and some disclosure about tokens. You know, the final thing I will say about this is everybody says, oh, we got to clarify whether something is a security or a commodity. And I recognize the difficulty of that. Part of that difficulty, though, is we don't have information on these tokens. How can you apply the Howey test, which says, you know, is it something whose value increases because of a common enterprise involving the managerial efforts of others? How can you apply that if you don't even know the governance of a token or the developers or their role going forward in enhancing that token? You know, so we need kind of basic disclosure. And in this respect, it's very similar to what Europe is doing by mandating a white paper before a token can get listed on a platform.
Tim, I just want to, nice to see you, first of all. I just want to pivot to the stablecoin issue, which you've done so much research on. And you know, so for a while, like, we're all old enough to remember when it looked like stablecoin rules would be the first thing that would, you know, pass. Like, there was a while when that looked just in the bag. Like, okay, everything's really complicated in the US, but at least we can get stablecoin regulation through. And there were all these different recommendations. What's going on? Like, it feels like nothing is happening. I mean, you've done so much research on this. Where are we with all these stablecoin regs that were supposed to be relatively easy?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Emily. You know, I put out a paper with Hal Jackson at Harvard and Dan Oury at Cornell where we said, look, the bank regulators could create a framework for regulating these things today under existing law and bring it, you know, at least bring it within the regulatory perimeter. And as you say, there were some really good efforts in Congress last year, particularly on House Financial Services, to come up with a bipartisan approach. I don't think those are dead. I know the chair, Patrick McHenry, wants to move that forward. Subcommittee Chair Hill also referred to that. We'll have to see if Democrats and Republicans can come together on that, and whether the administration can support that. You know, we've had a series of failures in the crypto industry that, frankly, I think have caused people maybe to take almost more extreme positions. You know, I think Democrats are very worried about doing anything that legitimizes this industry in a way that you know, gives people more confidence when they see a lot of concern, a lot of lack of investor protection. That's a very legitimate concern. And Republicans, many of them seem very concerned about the innovation moving offshore and so forth. I would still hope that on stablecoins they could come together. I think, you know, there has been good work on this. I think it is possible to put something together. I know the bank regulators have a lot of concerns about the movement of stablecoins on permissionless blockchains. And I share those concerns, but I think we're still better off trying to bring this activity within the regulatory perimeter and establish a framework than we are kind of trying to push it out.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, it seems like there's some resistance to stablecoin regulation because it's seen as legitimizing the industry. So basically what we're doing is keeping these stablecoins in a gray area, which just poses more of a risk to investors and seems to be defeating the purpose even further. I mean, that seems to be my read on what's going on. That's
how I feel. You know, again, I recognize the legitimacy of the concerns about movement of stablecoins on permissionless blockchains, where you may not have, it's hard to have the kind of protections against the use of stablecoins for illicit activity or the anti-money laundering protections. You don't know where the gas fees are going. it's funny, I was just having a conversation, I'm in London today, I was just having a conversation with someone at the European Commission, and they're struggling with the very same issues, as is the European Bank. But I think they're trying to come up with a way to move forward on this, again, because I think they're sort of looking at it saying we have to create a regulatory framework. So, it's not easy to solve these issues, but I think we're better off trying to tackle them than simply saying, no, this is going to remain outside the regulatory perimeter.
Quickly turning to Europe for a moment, because sort of dovetails with the stablecoin conversation. We have a report basically suggesting that the EU could veto large stablecoins. There was a comment that suggested that. And that's interesting also because, Tim, you and I have talked about this a little bit before. EU has been, some in the EU have been also pushing a central bank digital currency. And are these two things linked? And I'm just curious what you think. First of all, do you think the EU could potentially ban large or veto large stablecoins? And where is this coming from?
Yeah, no, I think that's the way MiCA is set up, that you have to get approval and it goes through a review process, and they could, if they felt like this is not, the structure of this does not address these risks sufficiently. That I would welcome that kind of approach. Again, in our paper, we said there should be this approval process, and obviously an approval process means you can turn somebody down. So, I think we do need that kind of thing, because what we've got right now is large stablecoins who aren't subject to any regulation except maybe states. And, I admire what New York State has tried to do in this area, but it's not nearly enough. This is a global industry. We at least need to have national regulation.
I'd love to get your take on Tether now. I know that you've said that it's a commodity and should be regulated as a banking product. Can you unpack that a little more for us?
Sure. Well, this came up yesterday because one of the industry lobbyists said that in response to a question, was talking about, a lot of the market, the spot market is commodities, and pointed out that Tether was a commodity, therefore couldn't be a security. And I corrected that because I said, wait a minute. Tether is a commodity because there is a futures contract on Tether. Anytime you have anything, any token, anything else that has a futures contract on it, that makes it a commodity. But if Tether decided to pay interest to its holders, it would be a security. So we've got to understand that this security versus commodity thing, it isn't always exclusive. That was the point I was trying to make then. Having said that, again, I think stablecoins, first of all, we should create the framework that says they can't pay interest and that they are regulated as banking products, meaning that they have to meet prudential requirements, adequate reserves, safely invested, adequate capital, adequate liquidity, as well as operational, standards. You'll still have trading of stablecoins, and you'll have to regulate that in the spot market. And again, insofar as there are futures contract on a stablecoin, that would be a derivative. That would be regulated the way we regulate all derivatives contracts by the CFTC.
Tim, you've offered solutions to so many regulatory questions. You offered some yesterday, you've offered some here on the show and in your writing. Do you think it's possible to bring these solutions to life without congressional action?
Well, again, we did write a couple of papers. I wrote a couple of papers with Hal Jackson, and then one Dan Oury at Cornell wrote us, where we said the SRO idea, as well as the stablecoin regulation framework, could be done without legislation. I think both the Biden administration would like to see regulation. I think a number of people in Congress would like to see legislation. A number of people in Congress want to see legislation. That's fine. I'm all in favor of legislation if we can get it done. But I think we've got to find ground where, Republicans and Democrats can come together, and where people who, the crypto enthusiasts and the crypto skeptics can come together. And that's, again, the formulation that I put forward yesterday, which, as I said earlier, former SEC Chair Jay Clayton and I first kind of wrote about this in a Wall Street Journal editorial or op-ed also. I think we could come together on a platform like that or an approach like that. I think if instead the Republicans try to rewrite the securities laws in a dramatic way, I think it's just going to be tough to find bipartisan support for that.
Tim, it's been a pleasure hearing from you this morning. Thank you so much for joining the show. That was former CFTC Chairman Timothy Massad.